Somewhere in the North Pacific, beneath miles of cold black water, there is a Soviet ballistic missile submarine. It went down in March 1968. The crew never surfaced, and the United States government, rather than walking away, decided to build a fake deep-sea mining ship and try to pull it back up. That is not a rumor. That is where this story begins.
Welcome to Unexplained History. I'm Tom McKenzie. What you just heard is not an exaggeration, and it is not the strangest part of what we're going to cover today. If you're new here, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And if you've been with us for a while, buckle in, because this one goes deep. Today, we're starting with a disappearance. One submarine, one patch of ocean so remote that the only things listening were machines, and one question that quietly grew into something far bigger than a Cold War footnote. I'll be honest, the more I read about this, the harder it gets to figure out where the official story ends and the rest begins.
March 1968. The North Pacific is doing what it always does, moving, churning, indifferent. Somewhere out there, a Soviet submarine called K-129 goes silent. It is a Golf II class vessel designed to carry ballistic missiles. It has a crew, and then, without any signal, without any distress call that anyone publicly acknowledged, it is simply gone. The Soviets search for it. They do not find it. But US acoustic sensors and intelligence assets are listening to the ocean in ways the Soviets may not have fully understood. Those systems pick up something. Not a message, not a signal, a sound. The kind of sound an implosion makes when a sealed metal hull gives way under pressure it was never meant to hold. American analysts begin to narrow down a location. Picture the rooms where that information lands. Fluorescent light. The clatter of telex machines printing out intelligence cables at odd hours. Men in shirt sleeves staring at readouts they are not allowed to discuss with their families. The data is partial. The picture is incomplete. But the outline of something is taking shape. A wreck, deep on the ocean floor, and a growing sense inside certain agencies that this is not a situation you simply fire away. A ballistic missile submarine carries more than steel and fuel. It carries weapons. It carries operational materials. It carries the kind of information that in 1968, both superpowers would have done almost anything to keep out of the other side's hands, or to get hold of themselves. If the wreck held anything intact, the intelligence value was difficult to calculate. And if a recovery attempt went wrong, the political cost would be just as hard to contain. That tension between what might be gained and what might be lost is the air this story breathes. And it does not stay inside government walls. Rumors begin to move. People who work near the edges of intelligence work, people in ports, in newsrooms, in university offices, start picking up fragments. Not the full picture, just enough to ask questions. One of the people who eventually starts asking questions is a woman named Harriet Ann Filippi. She is not a spy, she is not a government insider, but she is persistent in a way that turns out to matter enormously. When she runs into a wall of official silence, she does not turn back. She pushes harder, she files, she follows the process wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere isolating and slow and uncertain. That kind of determination, applied against that kind of secrecy, has a way of leaving a mark. We will come back to Harriet. Her story threads through this one in ways that matter beyond the legal details. For now, hold on to this. The ocean keeps its silence. The machines keep printing. And somewhere between the sonar pings and the classified cables, a decision is being shaped. One that will eventually require a cover story large enough to float.
That is the foundation of what we're building today. A submarine on the bottom of the Pacific. A government that knows roughly where it is. And a level of secrecy so deep that even asking about it in public becomes, for some people, a life-defining act. Which brings us to the question that drives everything that follows. Why did a single disappearance become a magnet for such extraordinary attention from U.S. intelligence, and what did that attention look like at the edges before any operation was announced? So, here is the question that sat in the back of a lot of minds in the early 1970s. A Soviet submarine had gone silent. No distress call, no wreckage anyone was talking about publicly. Just gone. And the people whose job it was to care about that were not saying much. When official silence meets a story that big, something fills the gap. Usually it is rumor. Sometimes it is something more organized than that. This is where that story gets interesting.
To understand why the disappearance of a single submarine could drive years of secret planning and public speculation, you have to understand what that submarine represented. A ballistic missile submarine was not just a weapon. It was a floating piece of a nation's nuclear deterrent. It carried missiles, technology, and the people trained to use them. Losing one, or finding one, had implications that went far beyond a single vessel. For American national security officials, a lost Soviet submarine sitting on the ocean floor was something worth extraordinary effort. A single hull could contain information, people, and technology that senior officials considered critical. That calculus, the potential intelligence value against the cost and risk of recovery, drove unusual thinking. Risk tolerance went up. Options that would normally seem far-fetched started to look reasonable. But outside those fluorescent-lit offices and closed briefing rooms, the public knew almost nothing. What filtered out came in fragments. An offhand mention from a naval officer. A gap in deployment records. Sailors who had heard something they were not supposed to repeat. In the newsrooms of the early 1970s, journalists pieced stories together from phone calls, bulletin board clippings, and sources who spoke carefully and often anonymously. The texture of that era is important. Telex machines, typewriter keys, cigarette smoke drifting through briefing rooms where the real agenda was never written on the slide. Information moved slowly, and the people controlling it had every incentive to keep it close. That combination, high stakes, tight control, and a press corps that knew something was being hidden, was exactly the environment where speculation takes root and grows. One person who came to understand that environment well was Harriet Ann Philippi. She had observed how the government managed secrecy up close, and what she saw left a mark. The frustration of hitting institutional walls, of asking reasonable questions and being met with careful non-answers, did not discourage her. It sharpened her. She began devoting real time to filing formal information requests, working with journalists, and pressing legal contacts about what agencies were actually required to disclose. Harriet's experience was not unique in that period. It reflected something a lot of people were learning at the same time, that classified stories did not stay hidden cleanly. They leaked at the edges, and once a story had enough pieces in circulation, it took on a life that no press office could fully manage. The K-129 story was exactly that kind of story. At the center of what eventually became public was a cover story. The Hughes Glomar Explorer, a large purpose-built vessel, was presented to the world as a commercial deep-sea mining ship, a project attributed to the well-known industrialist Howard Hughes. That cover was constructed specifically to conceal the ship's real purpose, a salvage mission aimed at recovering the lost Soviet submarine from the ocean floor. The scale of that deception, a purpose-built ship, an elaborate commercial fiction, tells you something about how seriously the people planning this operation took what might be sitting down there. For years, that cover held well enough to keep the mission out of the headlines. But the classified world and the public world were never fully sealed from each other. Reporters kept asking, sources kept hinting, and the persistent curiosity of people like Harriet, who refused to accept that the public had no right to know, kept the pressure on. The cultural power of a story this large, a missing submarine, a secret ship, a Cold War intelligence gamble, proved difficult to contain indefinitely.
What we have so far is a missing submarine that mattered enormously, a government that kept its response tightly controlled, and a press and public left to work with fragments. The silence created the appetite. The appetite eventually drove the questions into places the people in charge had not planned for. But how did technical intelligence and bureaucratic appetite convert a missing hull into a plan worthy of a purpose-built vessel? March 1968. A Soviet submarine goes silent somewhere in the Pacific. No distress call, no wreckage washing ashore, just absence. And for the people whose job it was to know where that vessel was, that absence was deafening. What happened next, how that silence was traced, and what it set in motion, is what we're looking at today.
The Soviet submarine K-129 was a ballistic missile submarine. It carried weapons, it carried crew, and in March of 1968, it vanished in the Pacific Ocean without any public explanation from either side of the Cold War. The Soviets launched a search. So did the Americans, quietly, and for their own reasons. What the United States Navy had were acoustic records. Underwater listening systems had picked up something, a signal consistent with a catastrophic event at a specific time, in a general area of the Pacific. It wasn't a clear picture, but it was a starting point. Analysts worked through the data carefully. Intelligence reports came in from multiple channels. Slowly, the probable location of the wreck began to narrow. It was deep, very deep, miles beneath the surface, resting on the sea floor in water so cold and so dark that conventional recovery was not even a question worth asking, at least not openly. But the potential value of what lay down there was hard to ignore. A ballistic missile submarine from a rival superpower, relatively intact, sitting on the bottom of the ocean. The intelligence possibilities were significant. Codes, weapons design, signals, equipment. If the wreck could be reached, what was recoverable could reshape what each side knew about the other. And if it couldn't be reached, or if the attempt was exposed, there would be consequences of a different kind entirely. The operation that grew from this moment was called Project Azorian. It was a CIA-led covert operation, and its goal was to recover the wreckage of K-129 from the Pacific seafloor. To do it, a purpose-built ship was eventually constructed, the Hughes Glomar Explorer. But that came later. In the beginning, there was only the problem, how do you even begin to plan something like this? And how do you keep it hidden? Secrecy was total. The people involved worked under strict compartmentalization. Even within agencies, most personnel knew only their own piece of the picture. The weight of that silence pressed outward in ways that weren't always visible, but they were felt. Harriet Ann Philippi was among those who came to understand, over time, just how much had been deliberately kept from public view. She observed the way official reticence worked, how agencies could maintain silence not through outright denial alone, but through layers of classification that made basic questions nearly impossible to answer. For Harriet, the gap between what the public might reasonably want to know and what agencies were willing to say was not abstract. It was concrete. It was a gap she encountered directly, and it shaped how she responded. That concern, That steady, serious concern about what was being withheld and why became something she carried with her for a long time. It influenced decisions. It led to sustained efforts to obtain records through whatever legal avenues were available. It gave a single classified incident a very long reach into one person's life. Meanwhile, in the operational world, the narrowing of the wreck's probable location was a kind of achievement in itself. It meant the question had moved from, did something happen, to, can we do anything about it? The cables, the deep-sea hardware, the cold mechanical realities of working at that depth, all of that still had to be invented or adapted. The salt and pressure and distance involved were not small obstacles. They were engineering problems that had never been seriously attempted before at this scale. What makes the March 1968 event so significant, beyond the immediate loss, is the chain it started. A single moment of disappearance, confirmed by acoustic data and assembled through intelligence work, set off a sequence of decisions that would involve enormous resources, elaborate deception, and years of classified effort. The people who lost their lives aboard K-129 could not have known any of that. Their families were told very little, and the wider public knew almost nothing for years.
What we've looked at here is really the moment a gap became a mission. Intelligence pointed to a location. The stakes were clear enough that serious people decided to act. And the secrecy around that decision had consequences that stretched far beyond the operation itself, into the lives of people like Harriet, who spent years trying to understand what had been done in the shadows. So the next question is a big one. What kind of engineering and cover would be required to mount a salvage attempt at that depth? And who could make such an idea plausible? So, we have a sunken Soviet submarine, miles down on the ocean floor, and the United States has decided it wants to bring it up. The question is, how do you even begin to attempt something like that? The answer involved building one of the most unusual ships ever constructed, and wrapping the whole thing in a story that was, frankly, hard to believe, which may have been the point.
Reaching a wreck at that depth is not a matter of sending down a diver. The pressure alone would be crushing. The distance involved, miles of open water above the target, meant that any recovery effort needed equipment that simply did not exist yet. Engineers would have to design it from scratch. The solution they arrived at was a vessel unlike anything operating at the time. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was enormous, grey, slow, and built around a concept that looked almost impossible on paper. At its heart was a covered moon pool, a large opening in the hull through which equipment could be lowered directly into the sea. Heavy cranes sat on deck. Below, winch systems were designed to carry tremendous weight on cables stretching down through miles of water. The mechanical grinding of those winches, the sheer industrial scale of the operation, gave the project a physical reality that matched the ambition behind it. This was not a modest salvage job. It was an attempt to do something that had never been done before, under conditions that allowed for almost no margin of error. The cover story chosen to explain the ship's construction and purpose involved Howard Hughes and a commercial deep-sea mining operation. Hughes was a figure already associated with secrecy and large-scale enterprise. The story was unusual enough to generate curiosity, but just plausible enough to deflect scrutiny, at least for a time. It gave the project a name, a public face, and a reason to exist that had nothing to do with the Soviet Navy. That cover story traveled. Reporters picked up pieces of it. Rumor filled in the gaps. The image of a giant ship built for mysterious purposes, with the name of one of America's most secretive industrialists attached to it. became part of the cultural texture of the era. It was a story designed to obscure, but it also had a life of its own. Harriet Ann Philippi was among those who later tried to understand how that public narrative had been constructed and what it had concealed. She felt the weight of a project that had merged engineering on a genuinely spectacular scale with layers of official secrecy. What unsettled her was not the ambition of the operation itself, but the way the theatrical cover around it had made honest inquiry so difficult. The story had been designed to travel and to confuse, and it had done both. Harriet began documenting the project's public traces, the filings, the press coverage, the official statements, and worked with historians and attorneys to track what had actually been disclosed over time. It was painstaking work, and it required accepting that some answers might never be fully available. The stakes behind the operation were real and significant. The financial outlay was enormous. Personnel were involved under conditions that carried genuine risk, and the diplomatic consequences of the operation being exposed, a U.S. attempt to recover a Soviet military vessel, could have been severe. Then there was the result itself. Evidence from declassified documents indicates that during the 1974 lift, only part of the submarine was actually recovered. A section broke away and sank back to the seabed. The operation, for all its scale and secrecy, produced a partial outcome. That detail, the wreckage falling back into the deep, gave the story a quality that no cover narrative could fully contain. Something had been attempted at enormous cost and effort, and it had not gone entirely as planned. What had been recovered, what had been lost again, and what any of it meant remained questions that the official record answered only in part.
A ship that size, a plan that complicated, and still the ocean kept part of what they came for. That's the kind of outcome that tends to deepen a story rather than close it. Which brings us to the next question. What people and public personas carried the project forward, and how did their roles deepen the story's reach? Behind every classified operation, there are eventually people who push back, journalists who chase a tip, litigants who file the paperwork, individuals who decide the public has a right to know, even when the machinery of official silence is working against them. This segment is about those people, not as heroes or villains, but as individuals who made choices, and whose choices left a lasting mark on how this story reached the rest of us.
By 1975, the operation had been underway for years behind an elaborate commercial front. A billionaire's name had been attached to it. A deep-sea mining venture had been constructed as a plausible explanation for an enormous ship and a very unusual mission. For a while, the cover held. Then the press got hold of it. In 1975, journalists including Jack Anderson and Seymour Hersh published disclosures that exposed key elements of the operation to the public. These were not accidental leaks absorbed quietly. They were reported, named, and circulated. The story moved from classified folders into newsrooms, and from newsrooms into the wider world. Both Anderson and Hersh were seasoned journalists with established records of reporting on government activity. Neither was operating on a hunch alone. Sources had talked, notes had moved. The telex machines and telephone lines of mid-70s newsrooms carried fragments of a story that officials had worked hard to contain. Once those fragments were in print, containment became considerably harder. What followed the press disclosures was not a flood of official transparency. It was, in many ways, the opposite. Agencies leaned into silence. Formal requests for documents were met with a carefully worded refusal. The government would neither confirm nor deny that certain records even existed. That phrase, and the legal posture behind it, would outlast the operation itself. It was in that environment that Harriet Ann Philippi entered the picture. Philippi pursued Freedom of Information Act litigation that directly challenged the government's refusal to acknowledge the existence of records related to the operation. She did not have the name recognition of a prominent columnist, but her case attracted national attention. The litigation that grew from her efforts helped shape what courts came to accept as a legitimate government response to certain information requests. The result was a formal legal doctrine, the Glomar response. Under this doctrine, an agency may decline to confirm or deny whether records on a given subject even exist, in cases where acknowledgement alone could reveal protected information. Harriet's name became part of the legal record. Her work, pursued with quiet resolve and a clear sense of public responsibility, contributed to a body of case law that journalists and researchers still encounter today when they submit requests touching on sensitive government activity. She collaborated with journalists and advocates for the release of records, and in doing so, she helped define the very limits of what the public could access. What is worth sitting with is the complexity of that outcome. Harriet's litigation was an effort toward openness, but the precedent it helped establish has been used ever since to justify official silence. A legal action taken in the spirit of public access helped formalize a tool of official restraint. That is not a contradiction that reflects poorly on her. It reflects the nature of law and how institutional power absorbs and redirects even sincere challenges. The journalists who disclosed the operation in 1975 and the litigants who pressed the courts afterward did not resolve the story. They extended it. Their choices shaped what questions could be asked in public and which answers would be withheld. That is a different kind of impact than a revelation, but it is a durable one.
Personal decisions by journalists and litigants shaped public access to knowledge and gave official silence a legal structure that lasted well beyond this single operation. What Harriet and the reporters who broke the story in 1975 set in motion was not a clean answer. It was a long argument about access, accountability, and what governments owe the people they work for. That argument eventually moved into archives and reading rooms, where researchers began building a documentary record, piece by piece, which raises the question we'll take up next. Which archives, documents, and institutional traces would later become the ground for historians to challenge or confirm the story's central claims? When researchers started pulling at the public record, they didn't find a clean story. They found fragments, procurement records, contractor notes, internal memos with whole sections blacked out. The picture that emerged was real, but it was never complete. What the archives did show was enough to be remarkable, and what they left out was enough to keep questions alive for decades.
The paper trail for Project Azorian runs through a handful of major repositories: the CIA's own Reading Room, the National Security Archives collections, and a category of source that researchers came to rely on heavily: declassified studies in intelligence and the agency's own internal histories. These weren't press releases. They were working documents, written for internal audiences, later pried into the open through years of requests and litigation. Harriet Ann Philippi was among those who understood the rhythm of that process better than most. A journalist who had pursued the story through legal channels, she had watched declassification arrive in installments, a page here, a study there, each release reshaping what could be said and what still couldn't. She used that material to inform legal arguments. She tracked each new release carefully, and when documents changed the picture, she updated her approach to match. There is something particular about working that way. You build a case from what exists, knowing full well that somewhere in a filing cabinet or a classified annex, there are pages you haven't seen yet. Harriet understood that. The record wasn't final. It was a work in progress, and she stayed with it. What the declassified internal histories and later scholarly work did confirm was significant on its own terms. Project Azorian represented an engineering achievement that pushed the limits of what was technically possible at the time. The deep ocean heavy lift systems developed for the operation advanced capabilities that have no direct civilian equivalent. Internal CIA assessments described the project as an engineering marvel, language that appears in the declassified record itself, not in outside commentary. Those same assessments were careful about the intelligence results. The operation's outcomes, in terms of what was recovered and what intelligence value that material held, were described with more caution. The technical success and the intelligence yield were treated as separate questions. That distinction mattered. It meant that even the official record, when it finally came, did not close the debate. It reframed it. The documents arrived slowly. Some contractor records were missing. Some pages were redacted. Some footnotes pointed towards sources that remained classified. Researchers assembling the public account had to work with a mosaic, pieces that fit together in places and left visible gaps in others. That is not a failure of the archive. It is simply what declassified records look like when an operation of this scale is only partially open to scrutiny. In the background of this research, you can almost feel the texture of the work itself. The mechanical grind of retrieval systems described in technical notes, the typewriter clatter of internal correspondence, the telex shorthand of messages moving between agencies. These were the sounds of a bureaucracy trying to manage something extraordinary, and the paper those sounds produced became the foundation that historians and journalists had to work from. For Harriet, the process had its own kind of weight. She had invested years in understanding what the record contained and what it withheld. Each successive release from the Reading Room or the National Security Archive collections was another opportunity to test earlier conclusions against new material. That kind of measured skepticism, staying curious without overstating what you know, is exactly what the archive demands of anyone who takes it seriously. Archival fragments can change how a generation understands an extraordinary operation, and missing pages can sustain competing interpretations for decades. The record that assembled itself around Project Azorian did both. It gave historians enough to work with and left enough open that the story remained genuinely contested.
That is the thing about a record like this. It is real, it is substantial, and it is still incomplete. The declassified studies confirmed remarkable things. They also left room for very different readings of what the operation ultimately meant. Which brings us to the question at the center of all of this. Given the declassified studies and archival fragments, how did the record invite both confident narrative and lingering uncertainty? So, we've spent time with the official record. What was acknowledged, what was released, and what was carefully worded to say as little as possible. But there's another current running through this story, and for a lot of people, it's the stronger one. It's built from first-person accounts, from operator pride, and from something you can actually watch on film. A burial at sea. Real people. A real service. And for many who've followed this case, that footage closes a lot of questions.
In September 1974, somewhere in the Pacific, a ceremony took place aboard the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Men in uniform, a flag, the kind of solemn ritual that marks the passage of the dead. It was filmed. That film still exists. According to multiple accounts, the recovery operation had brought up more than metal and wire. It had brought up people. 6 Soviet crew members reportedly recovered from the wreck of the K-129. Because of radioactivity concerns, they could not be returned to land. They were interred at sea, with ceremony, with witnesses, and on camera. That footage became one of the most emotionally charged pieces of evidence in the entire Project Azorian story. You cannot watch men lower a body into the ocean and walk away feeling like nothing happened. The image carries weight. It carries moral meaning. It says something was found, something real. For Harriet Ann Filippi, a researcher and legal advocate who spent years pursuing the documentary record of this operation, that burial footage was never incidental. It sat at the center of how she understood the case. She had witnessed again and again how vivid testimony could fill the space where official records went silent. She had seen how a single, clear image, men, a flag, open water, could do what 100 redacted documents could not. It could make an event feel real, present, and morally impossible to dismiss. Harriet's approach reflected that understanding. She prioritized testimonial accounts and documentary traces in her legal filings. She looked for the places where the human record and the archival record touched. When classified documents couldn't speak, she let the footage and the first-hand accounts carry the argument. And there was no shortage of accounts from those who had worked the operation. Operators and crew members spoke, sometimes carefully, sometimes with visible pride, about what had been accomplished. Some described recovered submarine components. Some described a haul that went well beyond what was ever officially confirmed. These weren't anonymous rumors. These were people who had been there. Some accounts went further. Claims circulated that the CIA had recovered the entire K-129 submarine intact. Others suggested that complete Soviet cryptographic codebooks, missiles, or intact warheads had been brought to the surface. These claims have never been officially confirmed. But they persisted. They spread. And for those who already believed the official line was a carefully constructed understatement, they felt entirely plausible. What made those accounts persuasive wasn't just the detail. It was the combination of things. The footage, the testimony, the artifacts reportedly aboard the ship, and the ceremony that acknowledged, without ever fully explaining, that human beings had been recovered from the deep. If the believer account holds, then the implications stretch far beyond salvage. The way human remains were handled, the decisions made under classified conditions far from any public accountability, raises questions that documentation alone may never fully answer. Harriet felt that tension clearly. The frustration wasn't just with missing files or redacted pages. It was with the gap between what the imagery showed, real grief, real ceremony, real human cost, and what the official record was willing to say. That gap is where the believer case lives, and for many people, it has never been adequately closed.
That's the force of this version of the story. It doesn't ask you to take anyone's word for something invisible. It points to a film. It points to people who were there. It points to a burial that actually happened in real water, witnessed by real crew. But here's where we have to slow down and ask, what makes operator recollections and documentary footage persuasive? And in what ways might those elements leave open other interpretations? So, we've heard the account at its most compelling. Testimonies, recovered artifacts, the sense that something extraordinary actually happened 3 miles under the Pacific. But compelling accounts still need to be tested. That's not about tearing the story down. It's about finding out where it holds and where it doesn't. And when researcher Harriet Ann Philippi started pulling on the documentary record, she found something that serious investigators always dread. Not just redactions, but gaps. Places where records should exist and simply don't.
Pressure testing a story like Azorian means going back to the paper trail. Not the memoirs, not the declassified summaries written years later, but the original working documents. Contractor hoist logs, inventory manifests, engineering sign-offs. The kind of records that, if you ran a salvage operation of this scale, you would expect to find in quantity. Those records remain partially absent or redacted. That could mean many things. Archival records are lost, misfiled, or withheld all the time. But it also means that some of the most specific claims made about the operation cannot be fully confirmed against primary documentation. The paper does not always match the story. Take the question of what was actually recovered. Some accounts have grown in the retelling. Claims circulate that the entire submarine was brought up intact, that complete codebooks were seized, that missile or warhead systems were recovered whole. But strong primary documentary evidence does not support those specific versions. Historians and journalists who have spent years on this record remain divided. These claims are disputed, and that dispute is real. There is also a technical dimension to this. Declassified engineering assessments outline the real limits of what a full hull recovery would have required. The depth, the weight, the mechanical stresses involved, these are not minor obstacles. Engineers who have studied those assessments point out that a complete lift of the entire vessel would have pushed the boundaries of what the equipment could physically achieve. That doesn't make a partial recovery less significant, but it does make the more expansive claims harder to sustain on engineering grounds alone. Then there is the collision theory. Some have claimed that K-129 sank after a collision with a US submarine, and that both governments covered it up afterward. It is a theory that has attracted serious attention over the years, but it remains a claim without the documentary foundation needed to call it established fact. The primary record has not produced confirmation. That doesn't close the question, but it does place a weight of caution on anyone willing to state it as settled. Harriet found herself staring at these silences with what you might call analytical concern. She had made FOIA requests, she had followed the official channels, and she kept running into the same wall. Redacted contractor records, missing inventory logs, archival entries that referenced documents she could not locate. It was not the presence of damaging information that unsettled her most. It was the structured absence of information that should have been routine. That experience changed how she worked. She refined her legal arguments to target specific categories of records rather than casting wide nets. She engaged scholars and archivists to help frame those gaps as evidentiary problems, not just bureaucratic inconveniences. Because she understood something important. When documentation is absent, competing narratives fill the space, and those narratives can shape policy, legal precedent, and public belief for a long time. In fluorescent-lit offices, long after the winches had gone quiet and the tapes had been filed away, people like Harriet were still working through the silence. The mechanical grinding of a deep-sea lift operation lasts weeks. The archival work that follows can last decades, and the questions it surfaces don't always have clean endings.
None of this means the operation didn't happen, or that nothing was recovered, or that everyone involved was lying. What it means is that the record has edges we can't yet see past. Some of what was claimed is not supported by the documents we have. Some documents we'd need simply haven't appeared. So here's what I want you to carry into the next part of this story. Where do the documentary, silences, and technical constraints make the believer account harder to sustain? And what questions remain open after this scrutiny? Some operations end when the mission is over. This one didn't. What Project Azorian left behind reached into courtrooms, engineering labs, and the lives of people who were just trying to get answers. The secrecy didn't disappear with the ship. It transformed. It became doctrine, it became precedent, and for some people, it became a decades-long wait.
Picture a fluorescent-lit government office, typewriters clacking, paper stacking up in trays. Someone files a records request under the Freedom of Information Act, asking the CIA what it knows about a classified deep-sea salvage operation. The CIA's answer, when it finally came, was unlike anything the law had seen before. The agency refused to confirm or deny that the records even existed. Not a flat no, not a redacted file, just a studied silence dressed up as a legal position. That response has a name now. It is called the Glomar response, and it came directly out of litigation connected to Project Azorian. The case that helped establish it involved Harriet Ann Philippi, a journalist who pursued CIA records through the courts. The litigation, including what became known as Philippi v. CIA, set legal precedents that are still applied today. When government agencies want to neither confirm nor deny the existence of sensitive records, they reach for the doctrine that Harriet's case helped shape. For Harriet, this was not an abstract legal victory. It was a long, careful fight carried out with quiet indignation and something close to resilient patience. She watched a phrase, neither confirm nor deny, move from classified briefing rooms into the everyday language of FOIA practice and public debate. She had pushed on a door, and the law on the other side had shifted. The Glomar response is now part of the legal landscape. Lawyers use it, journalists challenge it, courts weigh it. It entered the popular lexicon too. Shorthand for the particular evasion of an institution that will not say yes and will not say no. That is a concrete legacy. You can find it cited in legal briefs today. Meanwhile, the machine that made the operation possible left its own mark. The ship involved, a grey, lumbering vessel the size of a small city, built around a covered moon pool and equipped with heavy cranes, represented a genuine leap in what human engineering could do at depth. The lessons learned in designing and operating that platform fed into later work in heavy lift and deep ocean engineering. Techniques developed for a covert mission quietly migrated into the broader world of offshore and subsea technology. There was also something harder to measure. Crew members who participated in the operation had watched footage of sailors recovered from the deep being buried at sea with full military honors. That footage, and the ceremony it recorded, stayed with people. For those involved, it was a reminder that behind all the secrecy and engineering and legal maneuvering, there were human lives. That emotional weight did not dissolve when the files were eventually partially declassified. Harriet continued to monitor declassification efforts for decades after the original litigation. She advocated for FOIA reform in related contexts. The archive remained incomplete, but she kept watching it, reflecting on how public memory of the operation had grown into something bigger than the documents could fully explain or contain. Books, documentaries, and persistent questions filled the space that official records left open.
So here is where the operations story lands, at least for now. A legal doctrine that changed how government secrecy works. Engineering knowledge that outlived the mission's cover story. And an emotional residue that the passage of time hasn't fully dissolved for families, for researchers, for anyone who has watched that burial footage. Which brings us to the question we have to sit with going forward. What do the legal rulings, technological follow-ups, and cultural memories leave us with? A closed case, a cautionary tale, or an unresolved mystery that history will keep returning to? So, we've spent this episode inside one of the strangest operations in Cold War history. We followed the engineering, the secrecy, the legal battles, and the stories that grew up around all of it. Now it's time to be straight about what the record actually shows. What do we know? What remains genuinely unsettled? And what does it mean to live inside a story where parts of the truth are still locked away?
Here is what the declassified record supports. Project Azorian was real. The Hughes Glomar Explorer was purpose-built to lift a sunken Soviet submarine from the floor of the Pacific. In 1974, a recovery operation did take place. A section of the K-129 was raised. During the hoist, part of the target broke away and was lost back to the deep. What was recovered was examined. 6 Soviet crew members were found. They were buried at sea, with a ceremony recorded on film. The CIA has publicly acknowledged the mission. Artifacts and project-related items are displayed in the CIA Museum today. The agency's own reading room and materials held at the National Security Archive confirm the basic outline: an audacious engineering effort, a partial recovery, and a secret that held for years before finally coming into the open. Now for what the record does not support. Some accounts claim the CIA recovered the entire K-129 intact. The declassified materials do not back that up. The documented outcome is a partial lift, with a section lost during recovery. The claim of a complete retrieval remains contested and unconfirmed by any publicly available documentary source. Others have argued that K-129 sank after a collision with an American submarine, and that both governments covered the cause up. That is a theory that has circulated for decades. It may be sincerely held, but no declassified record released to date confirms it, and it remains in the category of the unverified. There are also claims that the operation recovered intact Soviet warheads, complete cryptographic codebooks, or functioning missiles. These are the most dramatic versions of the story, and they are the least supported. No declassified document released through official channels confirms the recovery of intact nuclear weapons, complete codebooks, or operable missile systems. These claims persist online and in certain accounts. Persistence is not the same as evidence. We can note them. We cannot confirm them. And on a program like this, that distinction matters. What this episode has also traced is the human cost of secrecy, not in the abstract, but in specific civic terms. Harriet Ann Philippi filed a Freedom of Information Act request for documents related to the Glomar Explorer. When the CIA refused to confirm or deny the program's existence, she challenged that response in court. The legal formula the government used to justify that refusal became known as the Glomar response. It is now a named legal precedent, applied in FOIA cases to this day. Her persistence contributed to partial declassification over time, and to the public museum acknowledgements that followed. Harriet received those archival acknowledgements, and museum references not as a complete answer, but as partial vindication. She continued to frame the debate in civic terms. What does a democratic public have a right to know about classified operations carried out in its name? That question did not originate with Azorian. It will not end here, but her case made it sharper and gave it legal form. There is something worth sitting with in that. One person's persistence in the face of institutional silence helped change how secrecy is litigated in this country. Think about what the CIA Museum exhibit represents. Artifacts from a mission this classified, displayed in a government institution, with the agency publicly acknowledging both the engineering ambition and the extraordinary secrecy involved. That is not a full accounting, but it is an acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, even partial, is different from silence. The Glomar Explorer sat in cold water for years before being repurposed and eventually scrapped. The questions it raised did not follow it to the bottom. They stayed on the surface, where the rest of us have been working through them ever since. Answering what Azorian recovered matters, because it shapes how we remember risk, secrecy, and the human cost of classified innovation. The engineers who built that ship solved problems no one had solved before. The sailors aboard the K-129 died in circumstances still not fully understood. The people who fought for public records spent years of their lives doing it. All of that deserves an honest account, even when the honest account includes gaps. What the record confirms is enough to understand the scale of what happened. What the record leaves open is enough to keep this story unfinished.
I think that's the most useful place we can leave this. Not with false certainty in either direction. The confirmed facts are genuinely remarkable on their own. The gaps are real, and they deserve to be called gaps rather than filled in with speculation dressed up as history. Which brings us to the question worth carrying forward. How do we live with partial records, and what might future releases or discoveries still change about this account?